with that national flavor. And the intention was that using the Integrated Chemicals Management Act, they would then develop a legislative brief, and you would have heard my colleague Dr. Mumbu talk about it. The draft legislation must be gazetted, and then there must be public comment on it, and then it would be laid in Parliament and become an act. So just to highlight some of the challenges, and many of you would know these challenges, and I won't go through all of them, but generally for waste and chemicals management, we see a lack of domestication in the multilateral environmental agreements specific to waste and chemicals legislation. It's often that the legislation is ad hoc in several places. The environmental authorities tend to have legislation. The pesticides boards tend to have legislation. So that was one of the biggest challenges that we faced. And in addition to that, the political will is another huge challenge in our region. Some of the drivers, as you could appreciate, being small island developing states, we do have insufficient landfill capacity. We have threats to our human health and environment, an increased cost to health by our states or governments, and of course issues with border control and porous borders. So there are quite a few drivers that really was instrumental in forcing the success of some of these, this uptake of the ICM Act. So the status of actions, Antigua and Barbuda are in a similar position where they are now exploring the approach to advance this work using their pesticides control boards respectively. Belize has just put forward their cabinet endorsement for the consolidation in the Industrial Chemicals Management Regulation. St. Lucia is also working to synergize with they have just recently done a pesticides management recommendations in order to get the national policy in place. Suriname has also used the Integrated Chemicals Management Act to inform the development of the Environmental Act, which was done in 2020. But one of the success stories right now for us is St. Kitts and Nevis, and we congratulate them. So the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Control Board did express their interests in developing a policy framework, and using the roadmap that was developed, they actually followed these steps, were able to get a consultant and have the consultations that were required to ensure that there was transparency. And they have now gone ahead and they've actually gone through each of these steps, and I could take you through them very quickly. So they've reviewed the existing regulations, they've identified the key legislations to be amended, they've mapped out their stakeholders and engaged with them through consultations, revised their national roadmap towards the harmonized legislation, consolidated the findings, and now they have produced a national draft which is called the Pesticides and Chemicals Management Bill 2022. Regrettably, St. Kitts and Nevis is now in stasis because elections have been called, but hopefully as soon as the elections are over, it will be taken up and we'll have that bill in place. So it is a huge success for us here in the Caribbean. And just to add, we do have some success at the national level and just to highlight some of the other achievements of some of the countries, Belize, Guyana, and Jamaica all have promulgated their, or managing their hazardous waste as promulgated for the Basel Convention, and of course Trinidad and Tobago through the import negative list has amended their legislation, and Trinidad and Tobago is also have drafted their Basel legislation for at a national level, which will hopefully be soon made into law. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, you can ask at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Battersing, for sharing with us the BCRC Caribbean experience in supporting parties in their region. And now I would like to turn attention to another multilateral environmental agreement, which is CITES, that, as you know, share some similarities with the Basel Convention. And it is a treaty that also regulates international trade, and it specifically requires parties to take appropriate measures to enforce the provision of the convention and to prohibit trade in specimens in violation thereof. So, Mrs. Gohan, thank you for being with us today. and for sharing with us information on steps taken under CITES to encourage and assist parties' legislative efforts. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. My name is Rachel Gochin and I'm a consultant in the CITES Secretariat Legal Unit. It's a pleasure to speak to you today about a project which is a big priority for the Legal Unit and for the CITES Secretariat as a whole, in which we believe contributes to an important part of CITES' success, that is, the effective implementation of the Convention. This project is entitled the National Legislation Project. It started up in 1992, and at that time it was heavily supported by NGOs, by Traffic, and also by IUCN. And it has continued to go from strength to strength since then. It was later on at CITES COP11 when it was equipped with the teeth and the structure that it has today and that I'm going to speak to you about. The National Legislation Project has become an important thread in the tapestry of the history of CITES, and we hope that there are useful lessons that we can share. So before I get into the what, the why, and the how of this specific project, I just want to give you some key facts about CITES to make sure that we are all on the same page about the foundations. And I know some of you will already be well aware of these. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. It was signed on the 3rd of March 1973, which we now celebrate as World Wildlife Day, and it came into force in 1975. It's a multilaterally legally binding agreement with 184 parties since Andorra recently joined, so that's 183 state parties and the European Union. CITES regulates trade in specimens of over 38,000 species of animals and plants. So CITES does not prohibit nor encourage trade. It regulates the trade that already happens, ensuring the sustainability and legality of that trade as it occurs at the international level. CITES is a dynamic instrument, and the structure of the treaty includes 3 appendices setting out listed species according to how threatened they are by international trade. Appendix 1 contains the most endangered species, and commercial trade is generally not allowed. When a species is included in Appendix 2, this means it's generally not threatened with extinction today, but parties consider that trade should be regulated to avoid the species becoming threatened in future. You need a certificate or a permit to allow trade for commercial purposes of a species under Appendix 2. Appendix 3 species may not be globally threatened, but one party might consider that trade needs to be monitored to avoid that becoming the case in future. So CITES is not a static instrument where species become listed and are then sort of carved in stone forever. The listing can change at the next meeting of the Conference of the Parties, depending on the trade status and the conservation status of the species. Agreed scientific criteria are used to assess whether proposals to list species should be approved before voting takes place at the COP. And we have our 19th COP this year in November in Panama. So diving into the National Legislation Project. The mandate for the Secretariat's work on this comes from a resolution of the Conference of the Parties, number 8.4, which is reviewed and updated from time to time. So why are we doing this project? Although CITES is legally binding on states, it's generally not self-executing. This means it cannot be fully implemented until specific domestic measures have been adopted for that purpose. It's therefore essential that CITES parties have legislation in place allowing them to implement and enforce all aspects of the Convention. National laws for implementing CITES are critical to ensure that trade in protected species is legal, sustainable, and traceable. Legislation is needed particularly to empower government officials to act, to regulate behaviour, and to articulate policy in relation to conservation of and international trade in wildlife. The legislation needs to be adequate, kept up to date, and efficiently enforced at borders and within countries. Adequate national legislation is key to ensuring that the relevant agencies within parties' administrations are designated in order to fulfil their specific roles under CITES, and that they're empowered to put in place effective wildlife trade controls. So how are we doing this? One of the keys to the success of CITES' National Legislation Project is that the commitments under CITES are quite specific and, if I can say, relatively narrow compared with some other MEAs. You can see on the slide that there are 4 key components of the Convention's commitments, which we are tasked with focusing on under this project. Parties submit to the CITES Secretariat their draft implementing legislation in whatever form that takes. We in the legal unit review it primarily against these 4 criteria, which are set out in Resolution 8.4. So parties' domestic measures must designate at least one management authority and at least one scientific authority, prohibit trade in specimens in violation of the Convention, penalise such trade with appropriate penalties, and confiscate specimens illegally traded or possessed and provide for them to be returned to the place of origin. So just to stress, there are many more complex elements to the CITES regime, both binding and recommended through resolutions, and we pick up on those in the review too, but these are the 4 key components. So based on this review that we undertake, legislation is placed in one of 3 categories, and we really appreciate the trust that parties place in the Secretariat to manage this process, and that's what really ensures its success. Category 1 contains legislation that is believed generally to meet the requirements of CITES. In Category 2, legislation might meet some of the requirements but not all of the requirements. And in Category 3, the legislation is believed generally not to meet the requirements for CITES implementation. We in the Secretariat report to the CITES Standing Committee on progress for this project, both in terms of which parties have submitted legislation or provided other updates, and in terms of the workshops and technical assistance which we have provided either on a regional basis or to specific parties throughout the intersessional period, so that that transparent picture is provided to the Standing Committee. You can see on this slide here a recommendation which was agreed on by the CITES Standing Committee this year in March in Lyon. It identified 6 parties which had not taken any steps or provided any communication to the Secretariat about their progress in putting in place implementing legislation, and it recommended that unless those parties would take appropriate steps within 60 days, there would be a recommendation to suspend all commercial trade in CITES listed species. This has a serious impact, particularly for economies where value chains in CITES listed species are a big contributor to the economy. And an example would be in Grenada, where the queen conch value chain is very important. In terms of the appropriate measures that need to be taken to engage with the project, you can see from the slide that we're pretty flexible, and we want to work with parties to support them to avoid suspensions rather than acting like a police force. I've heard it said that CITES isn't a police force trying to catch wrongdoing, it's more like a doctor trying to diagnose where the problem is with implementation and to help suggest solutions. So we reached out proactively to each of those parties, and we were delighted that 5 out of the 6 actually managed to either provide legislation in draft form or a legislative plan and avoid the suspension. So just to say a bit about what tools we use in delivering this project. There's a few key materials that CITES has developed which are pretty instrumental to our work supporting parties. One is the model law, which you can find on our CITES website. It was revised last year to reflect updates, for example, new resolutions from conferences of the parties, clarifying the roles of various CITES authorities. And we took the opportunity when revising the law to seek input from other relevant organisations like the Food and Agriculture Organisation. And that was important. That was an important step to make sure that we had taken on board other perspectives and commitments that parties might have to try to make it as easy as possible for them to reconcile CITES with other commitments. We also have a standard format for reports, which we use to set out our analysis of parties' legislation so that we provide those in a consistent format to the parties. We encourage sharing of best practice between parties, and this is something that we proactively encourage when, for example, organising regional workshops and delivering training on legislation. So we try to structure these to encourage dialogue between parties and the sharing of documents, laws and best practice as far as this is appropriate. It's really helpful when a party which has gone through the National Legislation Project process with the Secretariat participates in these capacity building exercises. And we've had a few great examples of parties such as Morocco, whose legislation is now placed in Category 1, has even travelled to participate in workshops in other regions to explain their experiences and share good practice. And Belize is another example of a party who is about to complete the passage of their CITES implementing legislation and has been very generous in sharing their experience in the region. So this next slide just again shows you some of the practical materials that we've developed in working with parties. You can see the legislative action plan format, which sets out the action that needs to be taken, the agencies involved, the deadline and the output. And this is really like a roadmap to take parties from the point where they might have no implementing legislation to having that Category 1 gold standard legislation. And you can also see a notification to suspend trade where parties have not engaged with the programme. And we do reach out proactively to parties before, during and after such a step to start working with them on how they can seek to have the suspension lifted. So to sum up, the National Legislation Project is really the flagship project of the CITES Secretariat Legal Unit. It's, personally speaking, it's a really rewarding part of our work, and it's great to engage so closely with the parties on their implementing legislation. It's an important thread in the tapestry of CITES history, and it's the one that we keep pulling to tighten up any gaps in implementation across the 184 parties. So I hope this run-through of the key points has been useful, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gahan. The information you provided is particularly relevant for the present COP, COP 15, which has before it a recommendation from the report on the final evaluation of the strategic framework for the implementation of the Basel Convention for 2012-2021, which aims to entrust to the committee with, and I quote, the review subject to the availability of resources and according to the priorities established by the Conference of the Parties for the given biennium of parties' implementation of the Convention in national law for the consideration of the next COP, COP 16, and subsequent meetings. COP 15 may wish to learn from the experience under CITES in this regard. So thank you. And now I will invite Mrs. Mbote. How do you say?
Yes,
it's okay, Mbote. So we may learn from the UNEP's work to support parties with their legislative implementation of our convention, the Basel Convention. So, Mrs. Mbote, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to share the different strands of work that UNEP is doing, both from the law division but across the board, that really speaks to a lot of the issues that people have been speaking to on implementation and basically bringing action to happen in different spaces. And within the law division, we do realize, and within UNEP we realize that environmental law is really very critical. And a lot of decisions, even within the United Nations Environment Assembly, has talked about the importance of the rule of law. Our flagship in this regard is the Montevideo Environmental Law Program, which has been in existence for 40 years. It is currently in its fifth iteration, which will be ending in 2029. And in this iteration, there is opportunity for countries to come in and identify actions within the Basel Convention to work with us at UNEP, building on previous work that we have done. The Montevideo program is implemented with national focal points, and as we are meeting here, the national focal points of Montevideo program are meeting in Nairobi. They started their meeting on Monday and will end on Wednesday. No, it will end tomorrow. And the idea is to identify the priorities. Whilst the document already has priorities, and the national focal points had a meeting online last year where they decided that air pollution was one of the priorities. They are currently discussing what is it that they need to work on. And this is helping countries to develop effective legislation strengthening implementation of environmental law, and also capacity building. And this happens at the request of countries. So the countries' needs is what triggers action from the Montevideo program. These are some of the priority areas that are recognized in the document, which you can access online. And pollution is one of them, of course, climate and biodiversity, and this is because also of the interconnections between the different areas. And there is also the cross-cutting activities. But what I'd like to point out, which is relevant for Basel, is that these priorities are not cast in stone. And we have always to remember that countries can actually approach us at UNEP and say they would want us to work with them on different things. And we've actually done that over time, helped countries develop national legislation or even look at legislation that they have developed and advised on that. Some of the cross-cutting issues are also relevant, issues of environmental crime, procedural aspects of environmental matters, and the whole question of the pillars of the Charter of the UN, human rights and development particularly. The backbone of the Montevideo program is the legal assistance platform. And here the countries put in their requests for assistance. And this acts as a clearinghouse, but it also contains profiles of countries. And it is a digital platform, so countries can get in and access support, get data, and also avail themselves of educational programs to help them implement their national legislation. Beyond the Montevideo program, UNEP has also worked over the years on waste management. And one of the things that UNEP has done is to develop guidelines on legislation, integrated waste management, and this was done as early as 2016. And building on this, UNEP came up with a guidance on policy and legislation for integrated waste management during a pandemic. And we also have a Green Customs initiative, which is very relevant for chemicals and waste. And the updated version of this was published in April, and the one that was published in April is in English, but we're going to have one in Spanish and French out by July. Another initiative by UNEP is the special program, and this was established by UNER, and basically this avails resources to countries upon application. And there have been a number of rounds that countries have been asked to apply for resources. They've gone up to the 5th round, and the last UNER 5.2 agreed to extend the program. So applications for the 6th round are ongoing. Other work that has been done under the special program is institutional strengthening. And you can see the very broad definition of institutional strengthening as enhancing sustainable institutional capacity of governments to develop, adopt, monitor, and enforce policy, legislation, and regulation, as well as gain access to financial and other resources to ensure sound chemicals and waste management throughout their life cycle. And this has been done within the Basel Convention, but also in other areas. And in the Basel Convention, the institutional strengthening activities have included submission of national reports, development of databases and inventories, and also development of regulations aiming at regulating the import and export of hazardous waste listed under the convention, and also mainstreaming of waste management at the country level or in the targeted sector. And I'd like to just point out that this is not the last you're hearing about the special program. There's going to be a side event on Friday. So you can actually attend that to hear more about the special program. And on this last slide, we have examples of countries that have availed themselves of special program project resources, Angola and Moldova, and done particular work that responded to their national needs. You can see, like in Moldova, the development of 2 sets of national legislation, draft regulations on shipments of waste and draft regulations concerning the export for recovery of certain waste, as well as having an inventory on hazardous waste. And what I see is that all the different conventions and the interventions that have been discussed actually find a space within different spaces, whether it's the special program or the Montevideo program. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mbote, and I am very glad to hear about this very important work that UNEP is doing to support parties with their legislative implementation of the convention. And I am sure that parties present in the room are also grateful to hear about all these opportunities that exist. So before opening the question and answer session, I would like to come back to Mr. Kojima. Mr. Kojima, is okay? And I would like to hear a little bit more about the experience and of experience that he detailed here on the work that is being undertaken to develop a clear criteria on exportation of plastic waste as a follow-up to the adoption of the Plastic Waste Amendment. So could you provide us with any lessons learned on this process that could be of interest of parties that are now facing challenges in domesticating the Plastic Waste Amendment? You have the floor.
Yeah, in the process to make a kind of the the guideline to distinguish the controlled plastic waste and the not controlled one. Yeah, we got kind of an input from the exporters of the plastic waste, and after we compile kind of draft kind of the guideline, we have a kind of a public comment session, I would say, the period. So we got the kind of the response from the exporters also in the public comment session, and we discuss about which is appropriate kind of a distinction between the controlled one and not controlled one. So So such kind of the interaction, dialogue with exporters, and also we need to know the kind of a process of the recycling of plastics. So based on such information, we create such kind of the classification of the controlled plastic waste stream and not controlled one. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To Dr. Mbumbo, I would go back to some of the information that provided. We understood that they faced some challenges when banning the single-use plastic bags nationwide. So please tell us about the measure that you took to alleviate all these oppositions from the industrial sector. For instance, there were any transition period or were socioeconomic measures put in place to accompany these bans?
Thank you, Chair, for your question. That's actually quite a complicated one because it touches on the, on the social and economic aspect. As I mentioned earlier, the campaign for eliminating plastic started 12 years before. We engaged the stakeholders, especially the plastics, the manufacturers. We also dealt with, we engaged exporters and importers. We didn't start with exemptions. We didn't start, ours was basically like a carrot and stick situation, whereby we just had to, we looked at, it was an aspect of timing, and we had to look at the political climate. We also had to look at, the feeling of the public. So the public were very much in support of this move. It's like they felt, what is the National Environment Authority doing about this? So that's why we started with the Gazette notice. And initially the plan was to have this Gazette notice just go for a short duration. But looking at the benefits that we just got almost immediately, like within 2 months, we saw like the environment was actually getting, it's started getting green and cleaner. We're actually more encouraged to work on that. So we learned by, we later now came to come up with procedural issues. It's like you start from the back, and we now developed what is called, and we have 2 regulations. There's what is called an extended producer responsibility. This extended producer responsibility guidelines is actually putting sectors into groups whereby we have those ones who are actually producing, like let's say the plastic bottles, the materials, they have a responsibility toward this this kind of product that they are making. We're also having our plastic management regulations that actually will provide a more comprehensive way of actually dealing with this. So we are regarding the traders much more. For example, they thought we were going to ban the plastic bottles. What we are doing is to discourage that, but also promote sound management of plastics in Kenya. We don't have economic incentives, but we felt that this was a problem that just needed to be stopped, and other procedural issues would follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mumbo. And now I would like to ask Mrs. Batterson that what suggestion can she give us on how to change the fact that there are a general lack of domestication of multilateral environmental agreements?
Thank you very much for the question, Chair. That's a very complicated question as well. It seems you have a knack of doing that. It really is because the different multilateral environmental agreements sit in different agencies often, and sometimes we just need to have a conversation and remove the silo. And what we see with, especially with waste and chemicals legal framework, we see that it sits in primarily two agencies, the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Control Boards or authorities, or the national regulatory agencies or ministries of environment. So they really have to have a conversation, and once the conversation begins and there's a political will to streamline the legislation because they are occurrent with the chemicals and waste conventions and what they're doing, then that's a great starting point, I would say. But certainly what we've seen with the Caribbean Basin is that you have to have that conversation, that openness, transparency, and really having that political support to get it going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your answer. Well, then I will thank our distinguished panelists. And now I am pleased to open the floor for any questions or suggestions or comments that you may have. So we don't have much time, but we still have some 10 minutes for that. So please, when taking the floor, specify to whom your question is addressed. Okay, the floor is open. Okay, let's go.
Sure, thank you. My name is Anthony May. I'm from Belize. I work with the Department of the Environment. I have a question for the doctor to your right. I just want to know of the experience in Kenya as it relates to the alternatives to single-use plastics. And so in Belize, we have legislated a ban on the importation of single-use plastics. And one of the challenges that we had was with regards to the alternatives, the biodegradable products that would replace these single-use plastics, and then how to come up with a standard to kind of ascertain what biodegradable means at a national level. I just wanted to know what was the experience in Kenya as it relates to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mumbo, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. The alternatives that we have basically the brown paper. We also have locally made or woven bags. And what we're looking at are these carrier bags that we're dealing with, not all kind of plastics. And we also issued exemptions. For example, when it comes to medical products, like let's say in the airplane, there's some food product that also needs to be packaged. And what we're doing right now, with the support of JICA, that is the Japan International Corporation, we already have FTIR machine, and this FTIR machine will actually help us to, there's some producers who are saying that they are bringing biodegradable practice into the country. So this will actually help us to distinguish whether this is biodegradable or not. We have the regulation that you're going to have in place is actually going to come up with the criteria of, normally when you apply for your exemption or when you want to apply for importation of these plastics, you come up with an application and attach a sample. So this sample is actually what we use for doing. So it's work in progress, but our experience is actually helping us to come up with these alternatives. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then
see, the successful implementation of all these waste management rules as well as chemical management rules, it largely depends upon the cooperation of chemical industry. Especially in developing countries, always the chemical industry is very reluctant to implement most of these rules. So how do you see the implementation, the cooperation from chemical industry in your country?
Please, I didn't hear your name and the country.
Yeah, my name is Ramesh Kumar from Stockholm Convention Regional Center, India.
Okay, from India, and the question was directed to whom?
Yeah, I could not get you.
To whom the question was directed to?
It is a general question.
Oh. Okay.
So you mean the kind of a role of chemical industries to recycle the plastics, right? So yeah, in Japan there are some chemical industries got the kind of a plastic waste and to utilize to make some kind of chemical recycling. I think they extract produce ammonia from the plastic waste, some steel industry also utilize the plastics waste as a kind of a substitute for cokes in the steel production process. So there are some kind of the plastic chemical recycling of plastic waste in Japan. So such kind of activities are stimulated by extended producer responsibility scheme. So after Japanese government implement such kind of regulation, EPR regulation, chemical industries or steel industries try to utilize the plastic waste in their production process.
Okay. Because what my experience is in most of the developing countries, there are rules and regulations exist, but their implementation is very poor. So that is the major drawback in the successful implementation of all these conventions.
Thank you very much. I hope you are satisfied with the answer. Any other question? Mr. Mumbo also wants to add something to that question.
Okay, I really agree with you totally. When it comes to the developing countries, when it comes to implementation, it's actually quite a challenge, and it's because of quite a number of issues. First, one of it is because of environment is not actually top on priority. So there's economy, there's industrialization, there's creating jobs, and that kind of scenario. But there's just speaking from what Japan mentioned about the extended producer responsibility. These are kind of regulations that we've actually made successfully with the industry. In fact, the industry is actually looking forward to implementing this regulation because it's actually going to help them to, to sort their own problem, because like they know amongst themselves who is not abiding to the law. So it's like they're looking so forward, because like now the government is coming up with a, with a tool that they can use to, but I really agree. There's really a challenge on implementing, and we're hoping that with this EPR, extended producer responsibility regulations, we'll be able to see some improvement on that. I cannot say 100%, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mumbo. I don't see any more questions. It is my pleasure to have you here today, and this will conclude our event. Thank you very much, and I would like to invite you to join me in expressing our gratitude to our panelists today. Thank you very much. Okay.
My chair.
The chair that you didn't know, huh?
I didn't know your country.
He didn't know my country. Imagine.
It was a city. It was a city.
Thank you very much.
And you, if you test positive,
I didn't carry my but I'll share with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, actually we are really now blowing it up into a plastic of
But Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Therefore, assist again if you want. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
I know that
We're looking at your model as and I hope we would just see in that direction, but they're available. It comes now. It used to come from ICT or something like that. Now it comes from a different bodies that's looking at the Basel and saying this thing should be done. We still don't pick up this time.
Let me wait. Make sure you get my name. Then you can landscape. Okay. My friend from Bahamas. Of course, I'm smiling.
Excuse the cute and cuddly, the same borders that the cute and cuddly are being taken to, which is where the dirty.
Yeah, but the other way.
Yeah.
And we also have a different culture. So for us, the dirty people come from New York. But yeah, so it's interesting. Well, perfect. Again, for stepping in and coming to this event.
And I hope we can work together. No, we can work
Even
more.
Even
more. Especially now we are ramping up the
Thank you, very nice.
I'm going back to the office now, so I'll tell them.